War and Peace, Book 2, by Leo Tolstoy. Translation by Constance Garnett. Part 1, Chapter 1. At the beginning of the year 1806, Nikolai Rostov was coming home on leave. Denisov, too, was going home to Voronezh, and Rostov persuaded him to go with him to Moscow and to pay him a visit there. Denisov met his comrade at the last posting station but one, drank 3 bottles of wine with him, and in spite of the jolting of the road on the journey to Moscow, slept soundly lying at the bottom of the posting sledge beside Rostov, who grew more and more impatient as they got nearer to Moscow. Will it come soon? Soon? Oh, these insufferable streets, bun shops, street lamps, and sledge drivers, thought Rostov, when they had presented their papers at the town gates and were driving into Moscow. Denisov, we're here! Asleep, he kept saying, flinging his whole person forward, as though by that position he hoped to hasten the progress of the sledge. Denisov made no response. Here's the corner of the crossroads, where Zahar the sledge driver used to stand. And here is Zahar too, and still the same horse. And here's the little shop where we used to buy cakes. Make haste, now! Which house is it? Asked the driver. Over there at the end, the big one. How is it you don't see it? That's our house, Rostov kept saying. That's our house, of course. Denisov, Denisov! We shall be there in a minute. Denisov raised his head, cleared his throat, and said nothing. Dmitri, said Rostov to his valet on the box, surely that light is home? To be sure it is. It's the light in your papa's study, too. They've not gone to bed yet, huh? What do you think? Mind now, don't forget to get me out my new tunic, added Rostov, fingering his new moustaches. Come, get on, he shouted to the driver. And do wake up, Vasya, he said to Denisov, who had begun nodding again. Come, get on. 3 silver rubles for vodka. Get on, shouted Rostov, when they were only 3 houses from the entrance. It seemed to him that the horses were not moving. At last, the sledge turned to the right into the approach. Rostov saw the familiar cornice with the broken plaster overhead, the steps, the lamp post. He jumped out of the sledge while it was moving and ran into the porch. The house stood so inhospitably, as though it were no concern of its who had come into it. There was no one in the porch. My God, is everything all right? Wondered Rostov, stopping for a moment with a sinking heart, and then rushing on again along the porch and up the familiar crooked steps. Still the same door handle, the dirtiness of which so often angered the Countess, turned in the same halting fashion. In the hall there was a single tallow candle burning. Old Mikhailo was asleep on his perch. Prokofy, the footman, a man so strong that he had lifted up a carriage, was sitting there in his list shoes. He glanced towards the opening door, and his expression of sleepy indifference was suddenly transformed into one of frightened ecstasy. Merciful heavens! The young Count! He cried, recognizing his young master. Can it be? My darling! And Prokofy, shaking with emotion, made a dash towards the drawing-room door, probably with the view of announcing him. But apparently he changed his mind, for he came back and fell on his young master's shoulder. All well? Asked Rostov, pulling his hand away from him. Thank God, yes. All, thank God. Only just finished supper. Let me have a look at you, Your Excellency. Everything perfectly all right? Thank God, yes, thank God. Rostov, completely forgetting Denisov, flung off his fur coat, and anxious that no one should prepare the way for him, he ran on tiptoe into the big, dark reception hall. Everything was the same card tables, the same candelabra with a cover over it. But someone had already seen the young master, and he had not reached the drawing-room, when from a side door something swooped headlong, like a storm upon him, and began hugging and kissing him. A second and a third figure dashed in at a second door and at a third. More huggings, more kisses, more outcries and tears of delight. He could not distinguish where and which was Papa, which was Natasha, and which was Petya. All were screaming and talking and kissing him at the same moment. Only his mother was not among them. That he remembered. "And I never knew. Nikolenka, my darling." "Here he is, our boy. My darling Kolya. Isn't he changed? Where are the candles? Tea! Kiss me, too. Dearest, and me, too." Sonia, Natasha, Petya, Anna Mikhailovna, Vera, and the old Count were all hugging him, and the servants and the maids flocked into the room with talk and outcries. Petya hung on his legs. "Me too!" he kept shouting. Natasha, after pulling him down to her and kissing his face all over, skipped back from him, and keeping her hold of his jacket, pranced like a goat up and down in the same place, uttering shrill shrieks of delight. All round him were loving eyes shining with tears of joy. All round were lips seeking kisses. Sonia, too, as red as crimson bays, clung to his arm and beamed all over, gazing blissfully at his eyes for which she had so long been waiting. Sonia was just 16, and she was very pretty, especially at this moment of happy, eager excitement. She gazed at him, unable to take her eyes off him, smiling and holding her breath. He glanced gratefully at her, but still he was expectant and looking for someone, and the old Countess had not come in yet. And now steps were heard at the door. The steps were so rapid that they could hardly be his mother's footsteps. But she it was, in a new dress that he did not know, made during his absence. All of them let him go, and he ran to her. When they came together, she sank on his bosom, sobbing. She could not lift up her face, and only pressed it to the cold braiding of his hussar's jacket. Denisov, who had come into the room unnoticed by anyone, stood still, looking at them, and rubbing his eyes. "Vasily Denisov, your son's friend," he said, introducing himself to the Count, who looked inquiringly at him. "Very welcome. I know you," said the Count, kissing and embracing Denisov. "Nikolenka wrote to us. Natasha, Vera, here he is, Denisov." The same happy, ecstatic faces turned to the tousled figure of Denisov and surrounded him. "Darling Denisov," squealed Natasha, and beside herself with delight, she darted up to him, hugging and kissing him. Everyone was disconcerted by Natasha's behavior. Denisov too reddened, but he smiled, took Natasha's hand, and kissed it. Denisov was conducted to the room assigned him, while the Rostovs all gathered about Nikolenka in the divan room. The old Countess sat beside him, keeping tight hold of his hand, which she was every minute kissing. The others thronged round them, gloating over every movement, every glance, every word he uttered, and never taking their enthusiastic and loving eyes off him. His brother and sisters quarreled and snatched from one another the place nearest him, and disputed over which was to bring him tea, a handkerchief, a pipe. Rostov was very happy in the love they showed him. But the first minute of meeting them had been so blissful that his happiness now seemed a little thing, and he kept expecting something more and more and more. Next morning, after his journey, he slept on till 10 o'clock. The adjoining room was littered with swords, bags, sabretaches, open trunks, and dirty boots. 2 pairs of cleaned boots with spurs had just been stood against the wall. The servants brought in wash-hand basins, hot water for shaving, and their clothes well brushed. The room was full of a masculine odor, and reeked of tobacco. "Hi, Grishka, a pipe!" shouted the husky voice of Vaska Denisov. "Rostov, get up!" Rostov, rubbing his eyelids that seemed glued together, lifted his tousled head from the warm pillow. "Why? Is it late?" "It is late. Nearly 10, answered Natasha's voice, and in the next room they heard the rustle of starched skirts and girlish laughter. The door was opened a crack, and there was a glimpse of something blue, of ribbons, black hair, and merry faces. Natasha with Sonia and Petya had come to see if he were not getting up. Nikolenka, get up! Natasha's voice was heard again at the door. At once! Meanwhile, in the outer room, Petya had caught sight of the swords, and seized upon them with the rapture small boys feel at the sight of a soldier brother. And regardless of its not being the proper thing for his sisters to see the young men undressed, he opened the bedroom door. "Is this your sword?" he shouted. The girls skipped away. Denisov hid his hairy legs under the bedclothes, looking with a scared face to his comrade for assistance. The door admitted Petya and closed after him. A giggle was heard from outside. "Nikolenka, come out in your dressing gown," cried Natasha's voice. "Is this your sword?" asked Petya. "Or is it yours?" He turned with deferential respect to the swarthy, whiskered Denisov. Rostov made haste to get on his shoes and stockings, put on his dressing gown, and went out. Natasha had put on one spurred boot, and was just getting into the other. Sonia was making cheeses, and had just whirled her skirt into a balloon and was ducking down when he came in. They were dressed alike in new blue frocks, both fresh, rosy, and good-humored. Sonia ran away, but Natasha, taking her brother's arm, led him into the divan room, and a conversation began between them. They had not time to ask and answer all the questions about the 1,000 trifling matters which could only be of interest to them. Natasha laughed at every word he said, and at every word she said, not because what they said was amusing, but because she was in high spirits, and unable to contain her joy, which brimmed over in laughter. "Ah, isn't it nice? Isn't it splendid?" she kept saying every moment. Under the influence of the warm sunshine of love, Rostov felt that for the first time for a year and a half, his soul and his face were expanding in that childish smile he had not once smiled since he left home. "No, I say," she said, "you're quite a man now, eh? I'm awfully glad you're my brother." She touched his mustache. "I do want to know what sort of creatures you men are. Just like us?" "No." "Why did Sonia run away?" asked Rostov. "Oh, there's a lot to say about that. How are you going to speak to Sonia? Shall you call her thou or you?" "As it happens," said Rostov. "Call her you, please. I'll tell you why afterwards." "But why?" "Well, I'll tell you now. You know that Sonia's my friend. Such a friend that I burnt my arm for her sake. Here, look." She pulled up her muslin sleeve, and showed him, on her long, thin, soft arm above the elbow, near the shoulder, on the part which is covered even in a ball dress, a red mark. "I burnt that to show her my love. I simply heated a ruler in the fire and pressed it on it." Sitting in his old schoolroom on the sofa with the little cushions on the arms, and looking into Natasha's wildly eager eyes, Rostov was carried back into that world of home and childhood which had no meaning for anyone else, but gave him some of the greatest pleasures in his life. And burning one's arm with a ruler as a proof of love did not strike him as pointless. He understood it, and was not surprised at it. "Well, is that all?" he asked. "Well, we are such friends, such great friends. That's nonsense, the ruler, but we are friends forever. If she once loves anyone, it's forever. I don't understand that I forget so quickly." "Well, what then?" "Yes, so she loves me and you." Natasha suddenly flushed. "Well, you remember before you went away. She says you are to forget it all. She said, 'I shall always love him, but let him be free.' That really is splendid, noble. Yes, very noble, yes?" Natasha asked with such seriousness and emotion that it was clear that what she was saying now she had talked of before with tears. Rostov thought a little. "I never take back my word," he said. "And besides, Sonia's so charming that who would be such a fool as to renounce his own happiness?" "No, no," cried Natasha. "She and I have talked about that already. We knew that you'd say that. But that won't do, because, don't you see, if you say that, if you consider yourself bound by your word, then it makes it as though she had said that on purpose. It makes it as though you were, after all, obliged to marry her. And it makes it all wrong. Rostov saw that it had all been well thought over by them. On the previous day, Sonia had struck him by her beauty. In the glimpse he had caught of her today, she seemed even prettier. She was a charming girl of 16, obviously passionately in love with him. Of that he could not doubt for an instant. Why should he not love her now, even if he did not marry her? Mused Rostov. But just now he had so many other joys and interests. Yes, that's a very good conclusion on their part, he thought. I must remain free. Well, that's all right then, he said. We'll talk about it later on. Ah, how glad I am to be back with you, he added. Come, tell me, you've not been false to Boris? That's nonsense, cried Natasha, laughing. I never think of him, nor of anyone else, and don't want to. Oh, you don't you? Then what do you want? I? Natasha queried, and her face beamed with a happy smile. Have you seen Dupont? No. Not seen Dupont? The celebrated dancer? Oh, well then, you won't understand. That's what I am. Curving her arms, Natasha held out her skirt as dancers do, ran back a few steps, whirled round, executed a pirouette, bringing her little feet together and standing on the very tips of her toes, moved a few steps forward. You see how I stand? There, like this, she kept saying, but she could not keep on her toes. So that's what I'm going to be. I'm never going to be married to anyone. I'm going to be a dancer. Only don't tell anybody. Rostov laughed so loudly and merrily that Denisov in his room felt envious, and Natasha could not help laughing with him. No, isn't it all right? She kept saying. Oh, quite. So you don't want to marry Boris now? Natasha got hot. I don't want to marry anyone. I'll tell him so myself when I see him. Oh, will you? Said Rostov. But that's all nonsense, Natasha prattled on. And I say, is Denisov nice? She asked. Yes, he's nice. Well, goodbye, go and dress. Is he a dreadful person, Denisov? How dreadful? Asked Nikolai. No, Vaska's jolly. You call him Vaska? That's funny. Well, is he very nice? Very nice. Make haste and come to tea, then. We are all going to have it together. And Natasha rose onto her toes and stepped out of the room, as dancers do, but smiling as only happy girls of 15 can smile. Rostov reddened on meeting Sonia in the drawing-room. He did not know how to behave with her. Yesterday they had kissed in the first moment of joy at meeting, but today they felt that out of the question. He felt that everyone, his mother and his sisters, were looking inquiringly at him, and wondering how he would behave with her. He kissed her hand, and called her you, and Sonia. But their eyes, when they met, spoke more fondly and kissed tenderly. Her eyes asked his forgiveness for having dared, by Natasha's mediation, to remind him of his promise, and thanked him for his love. His eyes thanked her for offering him his freedom, and told her that whether so or otherwise, he should never cease to love her, because it was impossible not to love her. How queer it is, though, said Vera, selecting a moment of general silence, that Sonia and Nikolenka meet now and speak like strangers. Vera's observation was true, as were all her observations. But like most of her observations, it made everyone uncomfortable. Not Sonia, Nikolai, and Natasha only crimsoned. The Countess, too, who was afraid of her son's love for Sonia as a possible obstacle to his making a brilliant marriage, blushed like a girl. To Rostov's surprise, Denisov, in his new uniform, pomaded and perfumed, was quite as dashing a figure in a drawing-room as on the field of battle, and was polite to the ladies and gentlemen as Rostov had never expected to see him. Chapter 2. On his return to Moscow from the army, Nikolai Rostov was received by his family as a hero, as the best of sons, their idolized Nikolenka, by his relations as a charming, agreeable, and polite young man, by his acquaintances as a handsome lieutenant of hussars, a good dancer, and one of the best matches in Moscow. All Moscow was acquainted with the Rostovs. The old count had plenty of money that year, because all his estates had been mortgaged, and so Nikolenka, who kept his own racehorse, and wore the most fashionable riding breeches of a special cut, unlike any yet seen in Moscow, and the most fashionable boots, with extremely pointed toes and little silver spurs, was able to pass his time very agreeably. After the first brief interval of adapting himself to the old conditions of life, Rostov felt very happy at being home again. He felt that he had grown up and become a man. His despair at failing in a scripture examination, his borrowing money from Gavrilo for his sledge drivers, his stolen kisses with Sonia, all that he looked back upon as childishness, from which he was now immeasurably remote. Now he was a lieutenant of hussars, with a silver-braided jacket and a soldier's cross of St. George. He had a horse in training for a race, and kept company with well-known racing men, elderly and respected persons. He had struck up an acquaintance, too, with a lady living in a boulevard, whom he used to visit in the evening. He led the mazurka at the Arharovs' balls, talked to Field Marshal Kamensky about the war, and used familiar forms of address to a colonel of 40, to whom he had been introduced by Denisov. His passion for the Tsar flagged a little in Moscow, as he did not see him, and had no chance of seeing him all that time. But still, he often used to talk about the Emperor and his love for him, always with a suggestion in his tone that he was not saying all that there was in his feeling for the Emperor, something that everyone could not understand. And with his whole heart he shared the general feeling in Moscow of adoration for the Emperor Alexander Pavlovich, who was spoken of at that time in Moscow by the designation of the Angel Incarnate. During this brief stay in Moscow, before his return to the army, Rostov did not come nearer to Sonia, but on the contrary drifted further away from her. She was very pretty and charming, and it was obvious that she was passionately in love with him. But he was at that stage of youth when there seems so much to do that one has not time to pay attention to love, and a young man dreads being bound, and prizes his liberty, which he wants for so much else. When he thought about Sonia during his stay at Moscow, he said to himself, "Ah, there are many, many more like her to come, and there are many of them somewhere now, though I don't know them yet. There's plenty of time before me to think about love when I want to, but I have not the time now." Moreover, it seemed to him that feminine society was somehow beneath his manly dignity. He went to balls and into ladies' society with an affectation of doing so against his will. Races, the English club, carousals with Denisov, and the nocturnal visits that followed, all that was different. All that was the correct thing for a dashing young hussar. At the beginning of March, the old Count, Ilya Andreevich Rostov, was very busily engaged in arranging a dinner at the English club, to be given in honor of Prince Bagration. The Count, in his dressing gown, was continually walking up and down in the big hall, seeing the club manager, the celebrated Feoktista, and the head cook, and giving them instructions relative to asparagus, fresh cucumbers, strawberries, veal, and fish for Prince Bagration's dinner. From the day of its foundation, the Count had been a member of the club, and was its steward. He had been entrusted with the organization of the banquet to Bagration by the club, because it would have been hard to find anyone so well able to organize a banquet on a large and hospitable scale, and still more hard to find anyone so able and willing to advance his own money, if funds were needed, for the organization of the fête. The cook and the club manager listened to the Count's orders with good-humored faces, because they knew that with no one better than with him could one make a handsome profit out of a dinner costing several thousands. "Well, then, mind, there are scallops in pie crust, you know." "Cold entrees, I suppose. 3?" questioned the cook. The Count pondered. "Couldn't do with less. 3. Mayonnaise, 1, he said, crooking his finger. "Then it's your Excellency's order to take the big sturgeons?" asked the manager. "Yes, it can't be helped. We must take them if they won't knock the price down. Oh, mercy on us, I was forgetting. Of course we must have another entree on the table. Oh, good heavens!" He clutched at his head. "And who's going to get me the flowers? Mitenka! Hey, Mitenka!" "You gallop, Mitenka," he said to the steward who came in at his call. "You gallop off to the Podmoskovny estate," the Count's property in the environs of Moscow, "and tell Maximka, the gardener, to set the serfs to work to get decorations from the greenhouses. Tell him everything from his conservatories is to be brought here, and is to be packed in felt, and that I'm to have 200 pots here by Friday." After giving further and yet further directions of all sorts, he was just going off to the Countess to rest from his labors, but he recollected something else, turned back himself, brought the cook and manager back, and began giving orders again. They heard in the doorway a light, manly tread, and a jingling of spurs, and the young Count came in, handsome and rosy, with his darkening moustache, visibly sleeker and in better trim for his easy life in Moscow. "Ah, my boy, my head's in a whirl," said the old gentleman, with a somewhat shamefaced smile at his son. "You might come to my aid. We have still the singers to get, you see. The music is all settled, but shouldn't we order some gypsy singers? You military gentlemen are fond of that sort of thing." "Upon my word, Papa, I do believe that Prince Bagration made less fuss over getting ready for the Battle of Schöngraben than you are making now," said his son, smiling. The old Count pretended to be angry. "Well, you talk, you try." And the Count turned to the cook, who with a shrewd and respectful face looked observantly and sympathetically from father to son. "What are the young people coming to, eh, Feoktista?" said he. "They laugh at us old fellows." "To be sure, your Excellency. All they have to do is to eat a good dinner, but to arrange it all and serve it up, that's no affair of theirs." "True, true," cried the Count, and gaily seizing his son by both hands, he cried, "Do you know, now I've got hold of you, take a sledge and pair this minute, and drive off to Betsuhov, and say that Count Ilya Andreevitch has sent, say, to ask him for strawberries and fresh pineapples. There's no getting them from anyone else. If he's not at home himself, you go in and give the message to the princesses. And, I say, from there you drive off to the Gaiety. Ipatka the coachman knows the place. And look up Ilyushka there, the gypsy who danced at Count Orlov's, do you remember, in a white Cossack dress, and bring him here to me." "And bring his gypsy girls here with him?" asked Nikolai, laughing. "Come, come." At this moment Anna Mihalovna stepped noiselessly into the room with that air of Christian meekness, mingled with practical and anxious preoccupation, that never left her face. Although Anna Mihalovna came upon the Count in his dressing-gown every day, he was invariably disconcerted at her doing so, and apologized for his costume. "Don't mention it, my dear Count," she said, closing her eyes meekly. "I'm just going to see Betsuhov," she said. "Young Betsuhov has arrived,
And now we shall get all we want, Count, from his greenhouses. I was wanting to see him on my own account, too. He has forwarded me a letter from Boris. Thank God, Boris is now on the staff.
The Count was overjoyed at Anna Mihalovna's undertaking one part of his commissions, and gave orders for the carriage to be brought round for her. "Tell Betsuhov to come. I'll put his name down. Brought his wife with him?" he asked.
Anna Mihalovna turned up her eyes, and an expression of profound sadness came into her face. "Ah, my dear, he's very unhappy," she said. "If it's true, what we have been hearing, it's awful. How little did we think of this when we were rejoicing in his happiness. And such a lofty, angelic nature, that young Betsuhov. Yes, I pity him from my soul, and will do my utmost to give him any consolation in my power."
"Why, what is the matter?" inquired both the Rostovs, young and old together. Anna Mihalovna heaved a deep sigh.
"Dolohov, Marya Ivanovna's son," she said in a mysterious whisper, "has, they say, utterly compromised her. He brought him forward, invited him to his house in Petersburg, and now this. She has come here, and that scapegrace has come after her," said Anna Mihalovna. She wished to express nothing but sympathy with Pierre, but in her involuntary intonations and half-smile, she betrayed her sympathy with the scapegrace, as she called Dolohov. "Pierre himself, they say, is utterly crushed by his trouble."
"Well, anyway, tell him to come to the club. It will divert his mind. It will be a banquet on a grand scale." On the next day, the 3rd of March, at about 2 in the afternoon, the 250 members of the English Club and 50 of their guests were awaiting the arrival of their honored guest, the hero of the Austrian campaign, Prince Bagration. On receiving the news of the defeat of Austerlitz, all Moscow had at first been thrown into bewilderment. At that period, the Russians were so used to victories that on receiving news of a defeat, some people were simply incredulous, while others sought an explanation of so strange an event in exceptional circumstances of some kind. At the English Club, where everyone of note, everyone who had authentic information and weight, gathered together during December, when the news began to arrive, not a word was said about the war and about the last defeat. It was as though all were in a conspiracy of silence. The men who took the lead in conversation at the club, such as Count Rostopchin, Prince Yuri Vladimirovich Dolgoruki, Valuev, Count Markov, and Prince Vyazemsky, did not put in an appearance at the club, but met together in their intimate circles at each other's houses. That section of Moscow society which took its opinions from others, to which indeed Count Ilya Andreevich Rostov belonged, remained for a short time without leaders and without definite views upon the progress of the war. People felt in Moscow that something was wrong, and that it was difficult to know what to think of the bad news, and so better to be silent. But a little later, like jurymen coming out of their consultation room, the leaders reappeared to give their opinion in the club, and a clear and definite formula was found. Causes had been discovered to account for the fact, so incredible, unheard of, and impossible, that the Russians had been beaten, and all became clear, and the same version was repeated from one end of Moscow to the other. These causes were the treachery of the Austrians, the defective commissariat, the treachery of the Pole Przebyshev and the Frenchman Langeron, the incapacity of Kutuzow, and, this was murmured in subdued tones, the youth and inexperience of the Emperor, who had put faith in men of no character and ability. But the army, the Russian army, said everyone, had been extraordinary, and had performed miracles of valor. The soldiers, the officers,
the generals, all were heroes. But the hero among heroes was Prince Bagration, who had distinguished himself in his Schöngraben engagement and in the retreat from Austerlitz, where he alone had withdrawn his column in good order, and had succeeded in repelling during the whole day an enemy twice as numerous. What contributed to Bagration's being chosen for the popular hero at Moscow was the fact that he was an outsider, that he had no connections in Moscow. In his person they could do honor to the simple fighting Russian soldier, unsupported by connections and intrigues, and still associated by memories of the Italian campaign with the name of Suvorov. And besides, bestowing upon him such honors was the best possible way of showing their dislike and disapproval of Kutuzow. If there had been no Bagration, somebody would have had to invent him, said the wit Shinshin, parodying the words of Voltaire. Of Kutuzow people did not speak at all, or whispered abuse of him, calling him the court weathercock and the old satyr. All Moscow was repeating the words of Prince Dolgorukov, "Chop down trees enough, and you're bound to cut your finger," which in our defeat suggested a consolatory reminder of former victories, and the saying of Rostopchin, that French soldiers have to be excited to battle by high-sounding phrases, that Germans must have it logically proved to them that it is more dangerous to run away than to go forward, but that all Russian soldiers need is to be held back and urged not to be too reckless. New anecdotes were continually to be heard on every side of individual feats of gallantry performed by our officers and men at Austerlitz. Here a man had saved a flag, another had killed 5 Frenchmen, another had kept 5 cannons loaded single-handed. The story was told of Berg, by those who did not know him, that wounded in his right hand, he had taken his sword in his left and charged on the enemy. Nothing was said about Bolkonsky, and only those who had known him intimately regretted that he had died so young, leaving a wife with child and his queer old father. Chapter 3. On the 3rd of March, all the rooms of the English Club were full of the hum of voices, and the members and guests of the club, in uniforms and frock coats, some even in powder and Russian kaftans, were standing, meeting, parting, and running to and fro like bees swarming in spring. Powdered footmen in livery, wearing slippers and stockings, stood at every door, anxiously trying to follow every movement of the guests and club members, so as to proffer their services. The majority of those present were elderly and respected persons, with broad, self-confident faces, fat fingers, and resolute gestures and voices. Guests and members of this class sat in certain habitual places, and met together in certain habitual circles. A small proportion of those present were casual guests, chiefly young men, among them Denisov, Rostov, and Dolohov, who was now an officer in the Semyonovsky regiment again. The faces of the younger men, especially the officers, wore that expression of condescending deference to their elders, which seems to say to the older generation, "Respect and deference we are prepared to give you, but remember all the same, the future is for us." Nesvitsky, an old member of the club, was there too. Pierre, who at his wife's command had let his hair grow and left off spectacles, was walking about the rooms dressed in the height of the fashion, but looking melancholy and depressed. Here, as everywhere, he was surrounded by the atmosphere of people paying homage to his wealth, and he behaved to them with the careless, contemptuous air of sovereignty that had become habitual with him. In years he belonged to the younger generation, but by his wealth and connections he was a member of the older circles, and so he passed from one set to the other. The most distinguished of the elder members formed the centers of circles, which even strangers respectfully approached to listen to the words of well-known men. The larger groups were formed round Count Rostopchin, Valuev, and Narishkin. Rostopchin was describing how the Russians had been trampled underfoot by the fleeing Austrians, and had to force a way with the bayonet through the fugitives. Valuev was confidentially informing his circle that Uvarov had been sent from Petersburg to ascertain the state of opinion in Moscow in regard to Austerlitz. In the third group, Narishkin was repeating the tale of the meeting of the Austrian Council of War, at which, in reply to the stupidity of the Austrian general, Suvorov crowed like a cock. Shinshin, who stood near, tried to make a joke, saying that Kutuzow, it seemed, had not even been able to learn from Suvorov that not very difficult art of crowing like a cock. But the elder club members looked sternly at the wit, giving him thereby to understand that even such a reference to Kutuzow was out of place on that day. Count Ilya Andreevich Rostov kept anxiously hurrying in his soft boots to and fro from the dining-room to the drawing-room, giving hasty greetings to important and unimportant persons, all of whom he knew, and all of whom he treated alike, on an equal footing. Now and then his eyes sought out the graceful, dashing figure of his young son, rested gleefully on him, and winked to him. Young Rostov was standing at the window with Dolohov, whose acquaintance he had lately made, and greatly prized. The old count went up to them, and shook hands with Dolohov. "I beg you will come and see us. So, you're a friend of my youngsters? Been together, playing the hero together out there? Ah, Vasily Ignatitch! A good day to you, old man." He turned to an old gentleman who had just come in. But before he had time to finish his greetings to him, there was a general stir, and a footman running in with an alarmed countenance announced, "He has arrived." Bells rang. The stewards rushed forward. The guests, scattered about the different rooms, gathered together in one mass, like rye shaken together in a shovel, and waited at the door of the great drawing-room. At the door of the anteroom appeared the figure of Bagration, without his hat or sword, which, in accordance with the club custom, he had left with a hall porter. He was not wearing an astrakhan cap, and had not a riding-whip over his shoulder, as Rostov had seen him on the night before the Battle of Austerlitz, but wore a tight new uniform with Russian and foreign orders, and the Star of St. George on the left side of his chest. He had, obviously with a view to the banquet, just had his hair cut and his whiskers clipped, which changed his appearance for the worse. He had a sort of naively festive air, which, in conjunction with his determined, manly features, gave an expression positively rather comic to his face. He had a sort of naively festive air, which, in conjunction with his determined, manly features, gave an expression positively rather comic to his face. Bekleshov and Fyodor Petrovich Uvarov, who had come with him, stood still in the doorway, trying to make him, as the guest of most importance, precede them. Bagration was embarrassed, and unwilling to avail himself of their courtesy. There was a hitch in the proceedings at the door, but finally Bagration did, after all, enter first. He walked shyly and awkwardly over the parquet of the reception-room, not knowing what to do with his hands. He would have been more at home and at his ease, walking over a ploughed field under fire, as he had walked at the head of the Kursk regiment at Schöngraben. The stewards met him at the first door, and, saying a few words of their pleasure at seeing such an honored guest, they surrounded him without waiting for an answer, and, as it were, taking possession of him, led him off to the drawing-room. There was no possibility of getting in at the drawing-room door from the crowds of members and guests, who were crushing one another in their efforts to get a look over each other's shoulders at Bagration, as if he were some rare sort of beast. Count Ilya Andreevich laughed more vigorously than anyone, and continually repeating, "Make way for him, my dear boy, make way, make way," shoved the crowd aside, led the guests into the drawing-room, and seated them on the sofa in the middle of it. The great men, and the more honored members of the club surrounded the newly arrived guests. Count Ilya Andreich, shoving his way again through the crowd, went out of the drawing-room, and reappeared a minute later with another steward carrying a great silver dish, which he held out to Prince Bagration. On the dish lay a poem, composed and printed in the hero's honor. Bagration, on seeing the dish, looked about him in dismay, as though seeking assistance. But in all eyes he saw the expectation that he would submit. Feeling himself in their power, Bagration resolutely took the dish in both hands, and looked angrily and reproachfully at the Count, who had brought it. Someone officiously took the dish from Bagration, or he would, it seemed, have held it so till nightfall, and have carried it with him to the table, and drew his attention to the poem. "Well, I'll read it then," Bagration seemed to say, and fixing his weary eyes on the paper, he began reading it with a serious and concentrated expression. The author of the verses took them, and began to read them aloud himself. Prince Bagration bowed his head and listened. "Be thou the pride of Alexander's reign, and save for us our Titus on the throne. Be thou our champion and our country's stay, a noble heart, a Caesar in the fray. Napoleon, in the zenith of his fame, learns to his cost to fear Bagration's name, nor dares provoke a Russian foe again," etc., etc. But he had not finished the poem when the butler boomed out sonorously, "Dinner is ready." The door opened, from the dining-room thundered the strains of a polonaise, raised the shout of victory, "Valiant Russian, festive sing," and Count Ilya Andreich, looking angrily at the author, who still went on reading his verses, bowed to Bagration as a signal to go in. All the company rose, feeling the dinner of more importance than the poem, and Bagration, again preceding all the rest, went in to dinner. In the place of honor between two Alexanders, Bekleshov and Narishkin, this too was intentional, in allusion to the name of the Tsar, they put Bagration. 300 persons were ranged about the tables, according to their rank and importance. Those of greater consequence nearer to the distinguished guest, as naturally as water flows to find its own level. Just before dinner, Count Ilya Andreich presented his son to the prince. Bagration recognized him, and uttered a few words, awkward and incoherent, as were indeed all he spoke that day. Count Ilya Andreich looked about at everyone in gleeful pride, while Bagration was speaking to his son. Nikolai Rostov, with Denisov and his new acquaintance Dolohov, sat together almost in the middle of the table. Facing them sat Pierre with Prince Nesvitsky. Count Ilya Andreich was sitting with the other stewards facing Bagration, and the very impersonation of Moscow hospitality did his utmost to regale the prince. His labors had not been in vain. All the banquet, the meat dishes and the Lenten fare alike, was sumptuous, but still he could not be perfectly at ease till the end of dinner. He made signs to the carver, gave whispered directions to the footman, and not without emotion awaited the arrival of each anticipated dish. Everything was capital. At the second course, with the gigantic sturgeon, at the sight of which Ilya Andreich flushed with shamefaced delight, the footman began popping corks and pouring out champagne. After the fish, which made a certain sensation, Count Ilya Andreich exchanged glances with the other stewards. "There will be a great many toasts. It's time to begin," he whispered, and, glass in hand, he got up. All were silent, waiting for what he would say. "To the health of our sovereign, the Emperor," he shouted, and at the moment his kindly eyes grew moist with tears of pleasure and enthusiasm. At that instant they began playing "Raise the Shout of Victory." All rose from their seats and shouted "Hurrah!" And Bagration shouted "Hurrah!" in the same voice in which he had shouted it in the field at Schöngraben. The enthusiastic voice of young Rostov could be heard above the 300 other voices. He was on the very point of tears. "The health of our sovereign, the Emperor!" he roared. "Hurrah!" Emptying his glass at one gulp, he flung it on the floor. Many followed his example, and the loud shouts lasted for a long while. When the uproar subsided, the footman cleared away the broken glass, and all began settling themselves again, and, smiling at the noise they had made, began talking. Count Ilya Andreitch rose once more, glanced at a note that lay beside his plate, and proposed a toast to the health of the hero of our last campaign, Prince Pyotr Ivanovich Bagration, and again the Count's blue eyes were dimmed with tears. "Hurrah!" was shouted again by the 300 voices of the guests, and instead of music, this time a chorus of singers began to sing a cantata, composed by Pavel Ivanovich Kurutsov. "No hindrance bars a Russian's way, valor's the pledge of victory. We have our Bagrations, our foes will all be at our feet," etc., etc. As soon as the singers had finished, more and more toasts followed, at which Count Ilya Andreitch became more and more moved, and more glass was broken, and even more uproar was made. They drank to the health of Bekleshov, of Narishkin, of Uvarov, of Dolgorukov, of Apraksin, of Valuev, to the health of the stewards, to the health of the committee, to the health of all the club members, to the health of all the guests of the club, and finally and separately to the health of the organizer of the banquet, Count Ilya Andreitch. At that toast the Count took out his handkerchief, and, hiding his face in it, fairly broke down. Chapter 4. Pierre was sitting opposite Dolohov and Nikolai Rostov. He ate greedily and drank heavily, as he always did. But those who knew him slightly could see that some great change was taking place in him that day. He was silent all through dinner, and blinking and screwing up his eyes, looked about him, or letting his eyes rest on something with an air of complete absent-mindedness, rubbed the bridge of his nose with his finger. His face was depressed and gloomy. He seemed not to be seeing or hearing what was passing about him, and to be thinking of some one thing, something painful and unsettled. This unsettled question that worried him was due to the hints dropped by the princess his cousin at Moscow in regard to Dolohov's close intimacy with his wife, and to an anonymous letter he had received that morning, which, with the vile jocoseness peculiar to all anonymous letters, had said that he didn't seem to see clearly through his spectacles, and that his wife's connection with Dolohov was a secret from no one but himself. Pierre did not absolutely believe either the princess's hints or the anonymous letter, but he was afraid now to look at Dolohov, who sat opposite him. Every time his glance casually met Dolohov's handsome, insolent eyes, Pierre felt as though something awful, hideous, was rising up in his soul, and he made haste to turn away. Involuntarily recalling all his wife's past and her attitude to Dolohov, Pierre saw clearly that what was said in the letter might well be true, might at least appear to be the truth, if only it had not related to his wife. Pierre could not help recalling how Dolohov, who had been completely reinstated, had returned to Petersburg and come to see him. Dolohov had taken advantage of his friendly relations with Pierre in their old rowdy days, had come straight to his house, and Pierre had established him in it and lent him money. Pierre recalled how Ellen, smiling, had expressed her dissatisfaction at Dolohov's staying in their house, and how cynically Dolohov had praised his wife's beauty to him, and how he had never since left them up to the time of their coming to Moscow. "Yes, he is very handsome," thought Pierre, "and I know him. There would be a particular charm for him in disgracing my name and turning me into ridicule, just because I have exerted myself in his behalf, have befriended him and helped him. I know, I understand what zest that would be sure to give to his betrayal of me, if it were true. Yes, if it were true. But I don't believe it. I have no right to, and I can't believe it. He recalled the expression on Dolohov's face in his moments of cruelty, such as when he was tying the police officer onto the bear and dropping him into the water, or when he had utterly without provocation challenged a man to a duel, or killed a sledge-driver's horse with a shot from his pistol. That expression often came into Dolohov's face when he was looking at him. Yes, he's a dueling bully, thought Pierre. To him it means nothing to kill a man. It must seem to him that everyone's afraid of him. He must like it. He must think I am afraid of him. And in fact I really am afraid of him, Pierre mused. And again at these thoughts, he felt as though something terrible and hideous were rising up in his soul. Dolohov, Denisov, and Rostov were sitting facing Pierre, and seemed to be greatly enjoying themselves. Rostov talked away merrily to his two friends, of whom one was a dashing hussar, the other a notorious duellist and scapegrace, and now and then cast ironical glances at Pierre, whose appearance at the dinner was a striking one, with his preoccupied, absent-minded, massive figure. Rostov looked with disfavor upon Pierre. In the first place, because Pierre, in the eyes of the smart hussar, was a rich civilian and husband of a beauty, was altogether, in fact, an old woman, and secondly, because Pierre, in his preoccupation and absent-mindedness, had not recognized Rostov, and had failed to respond to his bow. When they got up to drink the health of the Tsar, Pierre, plunged in thought, did not rise nor take up his glass. "What are you about?" Rostov shouted to him, looking at him with enthusiastic and exasperated eyes. "Don't you hear? The health of our sovereign, the Emperor!" Pierre, with a sigh, obeyed, got up, emptied his glass, and waiting till all were seated again, he turned with his kindly smile to Rostov. "Why, I didn't recognize you," he said. But Rostov had no thoughts for him. He was shouting, "Hurrah!" "Why don't you renew the acquaintance?" said Dolohov to Rostov. "Oh, bother him, he's a fool," said Rostov. "One has to be sweet to the husbands of pretty women," said Denisov. Pierre did not hear what they were saying, but he knew they were talking of him. He flushed and turned away. "Well, now, to the health of pretty women," said Dolohov, and with a serious expression, though a smile lurked in the corners of his mouth, he turned to Pierre. "To the health of pretty women, Petrusha, and their lovers too," he said. Pierre, with downcast eyes, sipped his glass, without looking at Dolohov or answering him. The footman, distributing copies of Kutuzzov's cantata, laid a copy by Pierre, as one of the more honored guests. He would have taken it, but Dolohov bent forward, snatched the paper out of his hands, and began reading it. Pierre glanced at Dolohov, and his eyes dropped. Something terrible and hideous, that had been torturing him all through the dinner, rose up and took possession of him. He bent the whole of his ungainly person across the table. "Don't you dare to take it!" he shouted. Hearing that shout, and seeing to whom it was addressed, Nesvitsky and his neighbor on the right side turned in haste and alarm to Betsuhov. "Hush! Hush! What are you about?" whispered panic-stricken voices. Dolohov looked at Pierre with his clear, mirthful, cruel eyes, still with the same smile, as though he were saying, "Come now, this is what I like." "I won't give it up," he said distinctly. Pale and with quivering lips, Pierre snatched the copy. You, blackguard!" "I challenge you," he said, and moving back his chair, he got up from the table. At the second Pierre did this, and uttered these words, he felt that the question of his wife's guilt, that had been torturing him for the last 24 hours, was finally and incontestably answered in the affirmative. He hated her, and was severed from her forever. In spite of Denisov's entreaties that Rostov would have nothing to do with the affair, Rostov agreed to be Dolohov's second, and after dinner he discussed with Nesvitsky, Betsuhov's second, the arrangements for the duel. Pierre had gone home, but Rostov with Dolohov and Denisov stayed on at the club, listening to the gypsies and the singers till late in the evening. "So, good-bye till tomorrow, at Sokolniki," said Dolohov, as he parted from Rostov at the club steps. "And do you feel quite calm?" asked Rostov. Dolohov stopped. "Well, do you see, in a couple of words, I'll let you into the whole secret of dueling. If, when you go to a duel, you make your will and write long letters to your parents, if you think that you may be killed, you're a fool and certain to be done for. But go with the firm intention of killing your man, as quickly and as surely as may be, then everything will be all right. As our bear-killer from Kostroma used to say to me, 'A bear,' he'd say, 'why, who's not afraid of one? But come to see one, and your fear's all gone. All you hope is he won't get away.' Well, that's just how I feel. À demain, mon cher." Next day at 8 o'clock in the morning, Pierre and Nesvitsky reached the Sokolniki copse, and found Dolohov, Denisov, and Rostov already there. Pierre had the air of a man absorbed in reflections in no way connected with the matter in hand. His face looked hollow and yellow. He had not slept all night. He looked about him absent-mindedly, and screwed up his eyes, as though in glaring sunshine. He was exclusively absorbed by two considerations: the guilt of his wife, of which, after a sleepless night, he had not a vestige of doubt, and the guiltlessness of Dolohov, who was in no way bound to guard the honor of a man who was nothing to him. "Maybe I should have done the same in his place," thought Pierre. "For certain, indeed, I should have done the same. Then why this duel, this murder? Either I shall kill him, or he will shoot me in the head, in the elbow or the knee. To get away from here, to run, to bury myself somewhere," was the longing that came into his mind. But precisely at the moments when such ideas were in his mind, he would turn with a peculiarly calm and unconcerned face, which inspired respect in the seconds looking at him, and ask, "Will it be soon?" or "Aren't we ready?" When everything was ready, the swords stuck in the snow to mark the barrier, and the pistols loaded, Nesvitsky went up to Pierre. "I should not be doing my duty, Count," he said in a timid voice, "nor justifying the confidence and the honor you have done me in choosing me for your second, if at this grave moment, this very grave moment, I did not speak the whole truth to you. I consider that the quarrel has not sufficient grounds, and is not worth shedding blood over. You were not right, not quite in the right. You lost your temper." "Oh, yes, it was awfully stupid," said Pierre. "Then allow me to express your regret, and I am convinced that our opponents will agree to accept your apology," said Nesvitsky, who, like the others assisting in the affair, and everyone at such affairs, was unable to believe that the quarrel would come to an actual duel. "You know, Count, it is far nobler to acknowledge one's mistake than to push things to the irrevocable. There was no great offense on either side. Permit me to convey—" "No, what are you talking about?" said Pierre. "It doesn't matter. Ready, then?" he added. Only tell me how and where I am to go, and what to shoot at," he said with a smile unnaturally gentle. He took up a pistol, and began inquiring how to let it off, as he had never had a pistol in his hand before, a fact he did not care to confess. "Oh, yes, of course, I know. I had only forgotten," he said. "No apologies. Absolutely nothing," Dólokhov was saying to Denísov, who for his part was also making an attempt at reconciliation, and he too went up to the appointed spot. The place chosen for the duel was some 80 paces from the road, on which their sledges had been left, in a small clearing in the pine wood, covered with snow that had thawed in the warmer weather of the last few days. The antagonists stood 40 paces from each other at the further edge of the clearing. The seconds, in measuring the paces, left tracks in the deep, wet snow, from the spot where they had been standing to the swords of Nesvitsky and Denísov, which had been thrust in the ground 10 paces from one another to mark the barrier. The thaw and mist persisted. 40 paces away nothing could be seen. In 3 minutes everything was ready, but still they delayed beginning. Everyone was silent. Chapter 5. "Well, let us begin," said Dólokhov. "To be sure," said Pierre, still with the same smile. A feeling of dread was in the air. It was obvious that the affair that had begun so lightly could not now be in any way turned back, that it was going forward of itself, independently of men's will, and must run its course. Denísov was the first to come forward to the barrier and pronounce the words, "Since the antagonists refuse all reconciliation, would it not be as well to begin? Take your pistols, and at the word 3, begin to advance together. 1, 2, 3. Denísov shouted angrily, and he walked away from the barrier. Both walked along the trodden tracks closer and closer together, beginning to recognize one another in the mist. The combatants had the right to fire when they chose as they approached the barrier. Dólokhov walked slowly, not lifting his pistol, and looking intently with his clear, shining blue eyes into the face of his antagonist. His mouth wore, as always, the semblance of a smile. "So when I like, I can fire," said Pierre, and at the word 3, he walked with rapid steps forward, straying off the beaten track and stepping over the untrodden snow. Pierre held his pistol at full length in his right hand, obviously afraid of killing himself with that pistol. His left arm he studiously held behind him, because he felt inclined to use it to support his right arm, and he knew that was not allowed. After advancing 6 paces, and getting off the track into the snow, Pierre looked about under his feet, glanced rapidly again at Dólokhov, and stretching out his finger, as he had been shown, fired. Not at all expecting so loud a report, Pierre started at his own shot, then smiled at his own sensation, and stood still. The smoke, which was made thicker by the fog, hindered him from seeing for the first moment, but the other shot that he was expecting did not follow. All that could be heard were Dólokhov's rapid footsteps, and his figure came into view through the smoke. With one hand he was clutching at his left side, the other was clenched on the lower pistol. His face was pale. Rostov was running up and saying something to him. No, Dólokhov muttered through his teeth. No, it's not over. And struggling on a few sinking, staggering steps up to the sword, he sank onto the snow beside it. His left hand was covered with blood. He rubbed it on his coat and leaned upon it. His face was pale, frowning, and trembling. Dólokhov began, but he could not at once articulate the words. "Come up," he said with an effort. Pierre, hardly able to restrain his sobs, ran towards Dólokhov, and would have crossed the space that separated the barriers, when Dólokhov cried, "To the barrier!" And Pierre, grasping what was wanted, stood still just at the sword. Only 10 paces divided them. Dólokhov, putting his head down, greedily bit at the snow, lifted his head again, sat up, tried to get on his legs, and sat down, trying to find a secure center of gravity. He took a mouthful of the cold snow and sucked it. His lips quivered, but still he smiled. His eyes glittered with the strain and the exasperation of the struggle with his failing forces. He raised the pistol and began taking aim. "Sideways! Don't expose yourself to the pistol," said Nesvitsky. "Don't face it!" Denísov could not help shouting, though it was to an antagonist. With his gentle smile of sympathy and remorse, Pierre stood with his legs and arms straddling helplessly, and his broad chest directly facing Dólokhov, and looked at him mournfully. Denísov, Rostov, and Nesvitsky screwed up their eyes. At the same instant they heard a shot, and Dólokhov's wrathful cry. "Missed!" shouted Dólokhov, and he dropped helplessly face downwards in the snow. Pierre clutched at his head, and, turning back, walked into the wood, off the path in the snow, muttering aloud incoherent words. "Stupid! Stupid! Death! Lies!" he kept repeating, scowling. Nesvitsky stopped him and took him home. Rostov and Denísov got the wounded Dólokhov away. Dólokhov lay in the sledge with closed eyes, in silence, and uttered not a word in reply to questions addressed to him. But as they were driving into Moscow, he suddenly came to himself, and lifting his head with an effort, he took the hand of Rostov, who was sitting near him. Rostov was struck by the utterly transformed and unexpectedly passionately tender expression on Dólokhov's face. "Well, how do you feel?" asked Rostov. "Bad. But that's not the point. My friend," said Dólokhov in a breaking voice. "Where are we?" "We're in Moscow, I know. I don't matter. But I have killed her. Killed her. She won't get over this. She can't bear—" "Who?" asked Rostov. "My mother. My mother. My angel. My adored angel. My mother." And squeezing Rostov's hand, Dólokhov burst into tears. When he was a little calmer, he explained to Rostov that he was living with his mother, that if his mother were to see him dying, she would not get over the shock. He besought Rostov to go to her and prepare her. Rostov drove on ahead to carry out his wish, and to his immense astonishment he learned that Dólokhov, this bully, this noted duelist Dólokhov, lived at Moscow with his old mother and a hunchback sister, and was the tenderest son and brother. Chapter 6. Pierre had of late rarely seen his wife alone. Both at Petersburg and at Moscow, their house had been constantly full of guests. On the night following the duel, he did not go to his bedroom, but spent the night, as he often did, in his huge study, formerly his father's room, the very room indeed in which Count Betsuhov had died. He lay down on the couch and tried to go to sleep, so as to forget all that had happened to him, but he could not do so. Such a tempest of feelings, thoughts, and reminiscences suddenly arose in his soul, that far from going to sleep, he could not even sit still in one place, and was forced to leap up from the couch and pace with rapid steps about the room. At one moment he had a vision of his wife, as she was in the first days after their marriage, with her bare shoulders, and languid, passionate eyes. And then immediately by her side he saw the handsome, impudent, hard, and ironical face of Dólokhov, as he had seen it at the banquet, and again the same face of Dólokhov, pale, quivering, in agony, as it had been when he turned and sank in the snow. "What has happened?" he asked himself. "I have killed her lover. Yes, killed the lover of my wife. Yes, that has happened. Why was it? How have I come to this?" "Because you married her," answered an inner voice. "But how am I to blame?" he asked. "For marrying without loving her, for deceiving yourself and her." And vividly he recalled that minute, after supper at Prince Vasili's, when he had said those words he found so difficult to utter, "I love you." It has all come from that. Even then I felt it, he thought. I felt at the time that it wasn't the right thing, that I had no right to do it. And so it has turned out. He recalled the honeymoon, and blushed at the recollection of it. Particularly vivid, humiliating, and shameful was the memory of how one day, soon after his marriage, he had come in his silk dressing-gown out of his bedroom into his study at 12 o'clock in the day, and in his study had found his head steward, who had bowed deferentially, and looking at Pierre's face and his dressing-gown, had faintly smiled, as though to express by that smile his respectful sympathy with his patron's happiness. And how often I have been proud of her majestic beauty, her social tact, he thought, proud of my house, in which she received all Petersburg, proud of her unapproachability and beauty. So this was what I prided myself on. I used to think then that I did not understand her. How often, reflecting on her character, I have told myself that I was to blame, that I did not understand her, did not understand that everlasting composure and complacency, and the absence of all preferences and desires, and the solution of the whole riddle lay in that fearful word, that she is a dissolute woman. I have found that fearful word, and all has become clear. Anatole used to come to borrow money of her, and used to kiss her on her bare shoulders. She didn't give him money, but she let herself be kissed. Her father used to try and joke to rouse her jealousy. With a serene smile, she used to say she was not fool enough to be jealous. "Let him do as he likes," she used to say about me. I asked her once if she felt no symptoms of pregnancy. She laughed contemptuously, and said she was not such a fool as to want children, and that she would never have a child by me. Then he thought of the coarseness, the bluntness of her ideas, and the vulgarity of the expressions that were characteristic of her, although she had been brought up in the highest aristocratic circles. "Not quite such a fool. You just try it on. You'll clear out of this," she would say. Often, watching the favorable impression she made on young and old, on men and women, Pierre could not understand why it was he did not love her. "Yes, I never loved her," Pierre said to himself. "I knew she was a dissolute woman," he repeated to himself, "but I did not dare own it to myself." And now Dólokhov. There he sits in the snow, and forces himself to smile, and dies with maybe some swaggering affectation on his lips in answer to my remorse. Pierre was one of those people who, in spite of external weakness of character, so-called, do not seek a confidant for their sorrows. He worked through his trouble alone. She alone is to blame for everything, he said to himself. But what of that? Why did I bind myself to her? Why did I say to her that "I love you," which was a lie, and worse than a lie, he said to himself. "I am to blame, and ought to bear—" what? The disgrace to my name? The misery of my life? Oh, that's all rubbish, he thought. Disgrace to one's name and honor. All that's relative. All that's apart from myself. Louis XVI was executed because they said he was dishonorable and a criminal. The idea crossed Pierre's mind. And they were right from their point of view, just as those were right, too, who died a martyr's death for his sake, and canonized him as a saint. Then Robespierre was executed for being a tyrant. Who is right? Who is wrong? No one. But live while you live. Tomorrow you die, as I might have died an hour ago. And is it worth worrying oneself when life is only 1 second in comparison with eternity? But at the moment when he believed himself soothed by reflections of that sort, he suddenly had a vision of her, and of her at those moments when he had most violently expressed his most insincere love to her, and he felt a rush of blood to his heart, and had to jump up again, and move about, and break and tear to pieces anything that his hands came across. "Why did I say to her, 'I love you'?" he kept repeating to himself. And as he repeated the question for the 10th time, the saying of Molière came into his head. But what the devil was he doing in that galley? And he laughed at himself. In the night he called for his valet, and bade him pack up to go to Petersburg. He could not conceive how he was going to speak to her now. He resolved that next day he would go away, leaving her a letter in which he would announce his intention of parting from her forever. In the morning, when the valet came into the study with his coffee, Pierre was lying on an ottoman, asleep, with an open book in his hand. He woke up and looked about him for a long while in alarm, unable to grasp where he was. "The Countess sent to inquire if your Excellency were at home," said the valet. But before Pierre had time to make up his mind what answer he would send, the Countess herself walked calmly and majestically into the room. She was wearing a white satin dressing-gown, embroidered with silver, and had her hair in 2 immense coils, wound like a coronet round her exquisite head. In spite of her calm, there was a wrathful line on her rather prominent marble brow. With her accustomed self-control and composure, she did not begin to speak till the valet had left the room. She knew of the duel, and had come to talk of it. She waited till the valet had set the coffee and gone out. Pierre looked timidly at her, over his spectacles, and as the hare, hemmed in by dogs, goes on lying with its ears back in sight of its foes, so he tried to go on reading. But he felt that this was senseless and impossible, and again he glanced timidly at her. She did not sit down, but stood looking at him with a disdainful smile, waiting for the valet to be gone. "What's this about now? What have you been up to? I'm asking you," she said sternly. "I? I? What?" said Pierre. "You going in for deeds of valor. Now answer me. What does this duel mean? What did you want to prove by it, eh? I ask you the question." Pierre turned heavily on the sofa, opened his mouth, but could not answer. "If you won't answer, I'll tell you," Ellen went on. "You believe everything you're told. You were told," Ellen laughed, "that Dólokhov was my lover," she said in French, with her coarse plainness of speech, uttering the word amant like any other word. "And you believed it. But what have you proved by this? What have you proved by this duel? That you're a fool. But everyone knew that as it was. What does it lead to? Why, that I'm made a laughing-stock to all Moscow, that everyone's saying that you were drunk and didn't know what you were doing. You challenged a man of whom you were jealous without grounds. Ellen raised her voice and grew more and more passionate. "Who's a better man than you in every respect?" "Hum! Hum!" Pierre growled, wrinkling up his face, and neither looking at her nor stirring a muscle. "And how came you to believe that he's my lover? Eh? Because I like his society? If you were cleverer and more agreeable, I should prefer yours." "Don't speak to me, I beseech you," Pierre muttered huskily. "Why shouldn't I speak? I can speak as I like. And I tell you boldly that it's not many a wife who with a husband like you wouldn't have taken a lover. But I haven't done it," she said. Pierre tried to say something, glanced at her with strange eyes, whose meaning she did not comprehend, and lay down again. He was in physical agony at that moment. He felt a weight on his chest, so that he could not breathe. He knew that he must do something to put an end to this agony, but what he wanted to do was too horrible. "We had better part," he articulated huskily. "Part? By all means. Only if you give me a fortune," said Ellen. "Part? That's a threat to frighten me." Pierre leaped up from the couch and rushed staggering towards her. "I'll kill you," he shouted, and snatching up a marble slab from a table, with a strength he had not known in himself till then, he made a step towards her and waved it at her,